What if everything you thought you knew about your family was a lie? After 40 years of marriage, Maggie uncovered a truth so devastating it would shake the very foundation of her world. A betrayal so deep, it involved her husband and her daughter-in-law. But it's not just the affair that will shock you. It's the devastating twist that no one saw coming. If you want to know what happens next, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment to share your thoughts. Could you ever forgive a betrayal like this? Maggie sat in the dimly lit living room, her hands clutching the crumpled letter she'd found hidden in David's drawer earlier that morning. Her heart hammered against her chest. The words on the paper were unmistakable, laced with affection that shouldn't have been there, especially not for someone who wasn't her. It wasn't the first time she'd found something odd. David had been distant lately, distracted. But this was the proof she needed. She called out to him, her voice steady but sharp. "David, we need to talk." He entered, wearing that familiar carefree smile, the one that had charmed her for decades. It faltered as he noticed the letter in her hand. His eyes flickered to it, then back to her, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. "What's this?" Maggie asked, her tone colder now. "You can explain this, right?" David stepped closer, attempting to take the letter, but Maggie pulled it out of reach. His usual confidence began to crack. "It's nothing, really, just some old stuff, Maggie. I didn't mean for you to see it." The silence stretched between them. Maggie's mind raced, the pieces of their life together suddenly feeling like a fragile web, one small tug away from unraveling. "I've been noticing things, David," she said slowly. "Things I shouldn't have to notice after 40 years of marriage." He stepped back, avoiding her gaze. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "I've seen the way you act around her, the way you look at Laura." David's face twisted with panic, but he tried to mask it. "Maggie, this isn't what you think. I've been distant, sure, but it was just a rough patch. You know, work and all. You've been busy with the house, the kids. I didn't want to add to it." Maggie's stomach churned as she stood up, facing him. She was done with excuses. "It's more than that, David. It's always been more than that. I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid." He swallowed hard. "I never meant for it to get like this. Laura—" "Laura?" Maggie cut him off, her voice rising. "Laura, our daughter-in-law? You've been carrying on with her?" David shook his head quickly, his hands shaking. No, it wasn't like that. We had a moment, okay? It happened a long time ago. It was a mistake, Maggie. A one-time mistake, I swear to you." The lie hung in the air, thick with tension. Maggie stared at him, her mind reeling. "A one-time mistake," she repeated, almost laughing. "A one-time mistake that lasted 10 years. David flinched as though she'd slapped him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Maggie stood there, feeling a cold fury settling in her chest. "I want the truth, David, now." His shoulders sagged, defeated. It wasn't just once, it wasn't just a mistake, but it was over, Maggie. We stopped. It was a long time ago. Maggie's heart hammered. She couldn't breathe. "So, you've been lying to me all this time," she whispered. "You've been lying about that and about everything else." David stood still, his face a mask of guilt and shame. Maggie felt sick. "You've been with her all these years, in secret, in front of our family. How could you, David?" "I never meant for you to find out like this," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I thought if I could bury it, forget about it, we could go on like nothing happened." Maggie's hands trembled as she gripped the letter harder, her nails digging into the paper. "And you think that's enough? You think I can just forget this, after 40 years, after everything we've built?" David looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you, Maggie, but you've been slipping away from me too. I don't know when it happened, but it did. And then there was Laura. Maggie stared at him, her mind spinning. She thought she had known David, truly known him. But this man standing before her wasn't the same person. The person she had shared her life with, raised children with, had loved. He was gone. And in his place stood a stranger, one who had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. David's confession hung in the air, suffocating the space between them. Maggie's breath was shallow as she tried to process what he'd said. The shock was too much. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. "Tell me everything," she demanded, her voice hoarse. "Tell me it all." David hesitated, his eyes flickering with regret. I don't even know where to begin. It started with small things. Laura and we just talked. At first it was nothing. You know how close we all were, how much she became part of the family. But then he trailed off, eyes darting around the room as though looking for an escape. "You got closer," Maggie finished for him, her voice cold. He nodded, his face drawn. "Yeah. But it wasn't like that at first. We talked about everything. Family, our lives. I thought it was harmless. But the more time we spent together, the harder it got. It felt like something was missing in my life." And she filled that space. Maggie's eyes burned with unshed tears. "So all this time, you've been having an affair with her, and you didn't think to tell me? You didn't think I'd find out?" David flinched. "I wanted to, I swear. I tried to pull away, but it was like I couldn't stop." "Stop," Maggie repeated, almost incredulously. "It wasn't about stopping, David. You kept going. You lied. To me. To our family." David opened his mouth, but no words came. Maggie looked away, staring at the floor, her mind whirling. She had always thought of their marriage as solid, unbreakable even. She'd been so sure. They'd built a life together. They had children, a home, memories. But now she couldn't help but feel like everything was a lie. She had been living in a house built on secrets. "Why her?" Maggie asked quietly, almost to herself. "Why Laura?" David shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering nervously. She was always there, Maggie. You were busy with work, with the kids. And Laura, she understood me. We connected in ways I didn't even realize were missing in our marriage. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. It wasn't planned." Maggie let out a bitter laugh. "Nothing ever is it?" There was a long silence. David's eyes flicked to the floor, shame washing over him. Maggie felt a knot tighten in her chest. She wanted to scream at him, to tear him apart for what he had done to her, to their family. But all she could do was stand there, numb. As the seconds ticked by, Maggie's mind raced. She thought of their son, Jason, who had no idea what had been happening right under his nose. She thought of Laura, the woman she had trusted like a daughter, the one who had been sitting at her dinner table for years. "How long?" Maggie asked, her voice barely a whisper. David hesitated. "A long time," he muttered. "Years." Maggie's heart sank. "Years, and you thought you could just hide it from me? From everyone?" David didn't answer. Instead, he looked at her with eyes filled with regret. But it was too late for regret. The damage had already been done. The silence between them was suffocating. Maggie stood there, her hands trembling, as she tried to make sense of what David had just admitted. Her mind replayed everything, the smiles, the quiet moments, the whispers she had once dismissed as nothing. It all felt like a cruel joke now. But the hardest part, knowing that the person she trusted most had been lying to her for years, hiding a dark secret in plain sight. "How could you do this?" Maggie finally whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "How could you betray me like this? With her?" David took a step toward her, but Maggie stepped back, unable to bring herself to be near him. "Maggie, I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "But I need you to know, I never wanted to hurt you." Maggie shook her head, her chest tightening with each word he spoke. "Then why didn't you stop? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you even try?" "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought it would pass. I thought I could fix things with you, with us. But by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late." Maggie swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that burned behind her eyes. "So, you were in love with her? That's what you're saying?" David's gaze flickered to the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "It wasn't just that. I don't know if I was in love with her, but I was in love with the way she made me feel. She gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing." The words stung, sharper than any insult. Maggie felt a cold wave of anger wash over her. "So it was about you. You wanted something and you took it. You didn't care about what it would do to me or Jason, or any of us." David nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own guilt. "You're right. I didn't care. I should have. But I didn't. And now I'm paying for it. I lost everything." Maggie's anger flared, but beneath it, a deep sadness gnawed at her insides. She had given him everything, her trust, her loyalty, her love. And for what? So he could turn around and shatter it all for a moment of selfish escape. "I don't know who you are anymore, David," Maggie said quietly. "I thought I knew you. I thought we built something real. But now I see everything was a lie." David's eyes watered. "Maggie, I'm so sorry. Please, just let me make this right. Let me fix this." "You can't fix this," Maggie spat, her voice rising. "You can't fix what's broken. You've already destroyed it. You've destroyed us. And you did it for what? For her?" David looked up at her, his eyes desperate, but Maggie didn't want to hear any more of his excuses. She didn't want to hear about how sorry he was, or how much he regretted it. The truth was, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. "You need to leave," she said, her voice low but firm. David recoiled, like he hadn't expected her to be so direct. "What?" "Maggie, leave," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I can't look at you right now. I can't even stand to be in the same room as you." David hesitated, his face twisting with pain. He opened his mouth to say something, but Maggie held up a hand to stop him. She wasn't going to listen. She had heard enough. "I said leave, David," Maggie repeated, her voice trembling with both anger and exhaustion. David finally nodded, his face pale. He turned away without another word, his footsteps heavy as he walked out of the room. The sound of the front door closing behind him felt like the final nail in the coffin. As the house went silent, Maggie collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with the weight of the betrayal. The tears that she had held back so fiercely finally came, and she let them fall freely. She felt like she was drowning in the pain of it all. The love she thought they had, the family they had built, it was all gone now. But as she sat there, a new thought began to form in her mind. If David could betray her like this, if Laura could betray her trust so easily, then maybe she didn't need them. Maybe she was better off without the lies, without the secrets. Maybe it was time for her to take control. She wiped the tears from her eyes, trying to steady her breath. There was no going back from this. The truth had been exposed, and now Maggie had to decide what to do with it. But first, she had one more thing to uncover. Maggie needed answers, and she wasn't going to let the mess David had created go unanswered. There was something more to this, something deeper than what he had admitted. David's confession, while devastating, didn't feel complete. Something still didn't sit right. She wasn't sure why, but she had a sudden urge to go through David's things again. She had already searched his phone, his emails, but there had to be something she missed. As she rifled through his desk drawer, something caught her eye. A small, unmarked envelope tucked beneath a stack of bills. Maggie's heart skipped as she pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a photograph. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. It was an old picture of Laura holding a newborn baby. But it wasn't Jason's child. The baby was clearly too young to be his. Maggie felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at the photo. She turned it over. There, written in David's hand, were 2 words. Our daughter. Her stomach twisted violently. Something wasn't adding up. Maggie's hands shook as she held the photograph, the words on the back blurring as her vision became clouded with tears. Our daughter. What the hell did that mean? Was this a mistake? Or was David hiding even more from her than she had realized? She flipped the photo over and over, examining every detail. The baby looked to be just a few months old, cradled in Laura's arms with a look of pure joy on her face. Maggie had known Laura since she married Jason, watched her grow from a shy, sweet woman into a mother. But this was a side of Laura she'd never seen. There was something about the closeness in the photo, the way Laura held the baby with such intimacy, that felt wrong. The baby's face was almost too familiar. It hit her like a punch to the gut. The baby wasn't just any child. It was David's. Maggie's pulse quickened. She couldn't breathe. The truth was impossible, but it was staring her right in the face. David's affair had resulted in a child. Laura's child. Their child. Maggie stumbled backward, clutching the photograph to her chest, as though it might shatter if she didn't hold it tight enough. The years of silence, the years of secrets, suddenly made sense in a horrifying way. All the times David had seemed distant, the late nights, the strange trips. He hadn't been working. He'd been with Laura, and now, somehow, she had a child that no one knew about, a child who should have never existed. Her mind spun. What was she supposed to do with this information? How could she confront him with something this big? This was no longer just about an affair. It was about a hidden family, a family that David had built with someone else while pretending everything was normal at home. Her eyes burned with fury. She couldn't let this go. There had to be more. She needed to know the truth. Maggie grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Jason's number. Jason picked up on the 3rd ring. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" Maggie's voice caught in her throat. She tried to steady herself, but her hands were shaking too much. "Jason, I need you to come home, right now." "Mom, what's going on?" Jason asked, his voice concerned. "Is Dad okay?" "Jason, please," Maggie said, cutting him off. "Just come home. I'll explain everything when you get here." There was a pause on the other end. "Okay, Mom, I'm on my way." Maggie hung up the phone, her chest tightening. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to know if Jason was ready to hear the truth. He needed to know. She wasn't sure how to break it to him, but the time had come. She couldn't keep this secret, even if it meant destroying what was left of their family. She walked into the living room and paced, the photograph still clutched in her hand. Her thoughts were racing. What if Jason couldn't handle it? What if he blamed her? Could he ever forgive David? And what about Laura? What kind of mother would have an affair with her father-in-law? What kind of woman would go this far? The door opened a few minutes later, and Jason stepped inside. He looked around, confused. "What's going on, Mom? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maggie didn't know how to answer. She couldn't hide it anymore. "Sit down, Jason," she said quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Jason took a seat, worry lining his face. "What is it? What's going on with Dad?" Maggie sat across from him, the photograph still in her hand. She didn't want to show him yet, but it felt like she had no choice. She exhaled slowly, gathering the strength she needed to speak. "Jason, your father, he's been having an affair with Laura." Jason blinked, the words clearly not registering. "Wait, what? What do you mean?" "I mean, for years, Jason. Your father and Laura?" Maggie couldn't finish the sentence. Saying it aloud made it feel even more real, like she was living in a nightmare. "They've been together. And there's something else, Jason." Jason stood up abruptly. No, you're lying. This is some kind of joke, right? This isn't funny, Mom." "I wish it was a joke, Jason," Maggie whispered, her voice breaking. "But it's not. It's the truth." Jason's face paled as he took a step back. "I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me?" Maggie closed her eyes for a moment. "I didn't know how. I thought I could fix it. But I can't fix it. And now you have to know, Jason. You have to know everything." She handed him the photograph. Jason stared at the image in disbelief, the color draining from his face as he processed what he was seeing. The baby in the picture, the child in Laura's arms. It was impossible. His mind couldn't reconcile the image with the reality. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that can't be. That's not—" Maggie nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "It's his, Jason. It's David's, and it's Laura's." Jason stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of shock. Then, like a wave crashing over him, the truth hit. His father had not only betrayed his mother, he had betrayed their entire family. And now the betrayal had a face. A child. Jason crumpled into the chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. How long? How long has this been going on? Maggie took a deep breath. "Too long, Jason. Too long. And I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if we can fix this." Jason looked up at her, his expression cold, hurt, and full of anger. "You don't fix this, Mom. There's no fixing this." Maggie's heart broke. She thought she could be strong, but now she wasn't sure how much more she could take. The family she thought she knew was gone. What was left? "I need to go see him," Jason said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it that Maggie had never heard before. "Jason, no," Maggie said, trying to stop him. "You don't need to talk to him. Not yet. Not like this." But Jason was already walking toward the door. "I need to face him. I need to know if he even deserves to be called my father." And with that, Jason was gone. The door slammed behind him, and Maggie was left alone with the ruins of her life, a broken family, and a truth that she could never take back. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the empty house. Maggie stood frozen in place for a moment, her chest tight with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Jason was going after David, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. As much as she wanted to shield her son from the pain, she knew this confrontation was inevitable. It had to happen. She paced the room, her mind racing. The silence was oppressive. The secrets had spilled out, and now, like a broken dam, everything was coming at her in waves. David, Laura, the child, everything was shattered. Jason was angry. No, not angry. He was devastated, betrayed in ways that Maggie herself couldn't even process yet. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get any comfort from David. Maggie grabbed her phone again, her fingers shaking as she called David's number. The line rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. She tried again. Nothing. Her mind flashed back to the earlier conversation, the lies, the guilt, the look in David's eyes when he confessed. He hadn't wanted this, but he'd done it. He had ruined everything. And now Jason was going to be forced to confront the father who had destroyed their family, to face the man who had lied to him for years. She sat down heavily, waiting for Jason's return, but she couldn't sit still. She grabbed the photo of the baby again, her eyes scanning it like it held the key to everything. It didn't. There was no explanation that would make this okay. Not for her, not for Jason, and certainly not for the child in the picture. Maggie's phone buzzed in her hand, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Jason. "I'm going to his office. I need answers, Mom." Maggie stared at the message for a long moment. She wanted to tell him to come home, that they would figure this out together, but she knew he wouldn't listen. He needed to hear it from David himself, just as she had. And the reality was, Maggie didn't know how much more of this she could handle. Her stomach churned at the thought of what was coming next. Jason was going to tear into his father. He would demand answers, demand the truth. And David would either break down completely or he would lie again. Either way, it wouldn't be enough. It could never be enough. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from David. She didn't answer. David's office was a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. It was the kind of place David had always preferred, tucked away from the chaos, a little hideaway for all his secrets. Jason stood outside the door, fists clenched at his sides, his breath steady, but his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This wasn't just about his father's betrayal of his mother. This wasn't even about the affair, the lies, or the secrets. This was about trust. This was about the man who had been his father for over 30 years, the man who had raised him, taught him, and loved him. Or so he had thought. Jason took a deep breath and pushed open the door. David looked up from behind his desk, his face dropping into a look of pure guilt. He hadn't expected this. He had thought he might be able to run, to hide, maybe even avoid this confrontation for a little while longer. But Jason was here, and Jason had questions. "Jason," David said quietly, standing up as if to offer a greeting, but his voice lacked the usual warmth. "Sit down, Dad," Jason said, his voice cold. There was no pleasantry in it, no room for softness. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. David hesitated but sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving Jason's face. He could see the anger, the hurt, the betrayal in his son's eyes. He couldn't escape it. "I saw the photo," Jason said, his voice steady but edged with fury. "I saw the damn photo, Dad. You think I didn't know? You think I didn't see how you and Laura looked at each other? How you always acted like she was more than just my wife's sister? You thought I was blind?" David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, and he didn't know where to start. There was no way to explain this, no way to make it sound anything less than what it was. His son was right. He had lied. He had betrayed everything that Jason had ever believed in. "Dad, I need to hear you say it," Jason said, his voice breaking slightly. "Tell me it's true. Tell me you have a child with her. Tell me it's been going on for years." David closed his eyes. He had never felt so small, so ashamed. "Jason, No," Jason interrupted, his voice rising. "No more lies. Just tell me the truth. I need to hear you say it." David's shoulders sagged. There was no point in denying it any longer. "It's true," he said quietly. "Laura and we have a child. We've been seeing each other for years. I never meant for it to go this far, but I couldn't stop. I was weak." Jason's jaw tightened, his fists shaking. "Weak? Is that what you call it? You destroyed everything we had, Dad. You destroyed her. You destroyed Mom. And you think it's because you were weak?" David didn't respond. He couldn't. How could he explain something so utterly unforgivable? How could he justify betraying his wife, his family, his son? Jason stood up, pacing in anger. I don't even know who you are anymore. You're not my father. You're some pathetic man who can't even control his own life, let alone respect his family. David felt the weight of Jason's words like a physical blow. I'm sorry, Jason, he whispered. I truly am. Jason looked at him for a long, painful moment. Sorry doesn't fix this. You broke us, and there's no going back. Jason turned to leave, but before he walked out the door, he paused and looked over his shoulder. You know, I always thought I'd want you to explain yourself one day, but now I don't think I care anymore. With that, Jason walked out of David's office, leaving his father alone in the quiet, sterile room. The silence was deafening, a reminder that everything was broken now. There was no fixing it. There was no way to undo the damage that had been done. David slumped back in his chair, his face buried in his hands. Maggie sat on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear, waiting for any sign of Jason's return. Her heart raced, each second dragging by in a suffocating silence. She had hoped he would call or text or even just walk through the door, but there was nothing. The longer it took, the more her mind wandered. What was happening? What was David doing now? What had Jason said to him? The minutes felt like hours. She couldn't sit still any longer. Her hands trembled as she picked up the photograph again, studying the baby's face. The child that had no place in her world. The child that had shattered everything. She thought about calling David, confronting him directly, but part of her knew it wouldn't change anything. What could he say now? Nothing could fix what he'd done. Not to her. Not to Jason. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Maggie heard the sound of footsteps on the front porch. Jason was home. She stood up, her body stiff, her heart heavy with both dread and relief. The door opened, and Jason stepped inside, his face pale, eyes hollow. His posture was rigid, like he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. Jason didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Maggie could see the storm brewing inside him. He was hurting, more than she could even comprehend. The anger was still there, raw and fresh. But underneath that, there was something darker, something that had broken in him, something he couldn't fix. How'd it go? Maggie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jason walked past her, his movements stiff, like he was trying to distance himself from everything in the room, including her. It's done, he said flatly, collapsing onto the couch. I told him exactly what I thought of him. Told him he wasn't my father anymore. Maggie sat beside him, but he didn't look at her. He couldn't. The weight of what he had done, the words he had said to David, was still settling in. He didn't even try to make it right, Mom. Jason continued, his voice rough. He didn't even apologize like he meant it. He just sat there looking pathetic. I'm so sorry, Jason, Maggie said, her own voice breaking. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she wasn't sure if she even had the right to anymore. She wasn't sure where she stood in this mess. I never wanted you to know all of this. I never wanted you to see him for who he really is. Jason turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since he'd come home. You didn't make him do this, Mom. Don't blame yourself. This is all on him. He paused, taking a deep breath. But I can't look at him the same way anymore. I can't unsee what I saw in his office. I can't just pretend it never happened. Maggie nodded slowly, the truth of his words sinking in. How could any of them go back to what they had before? The foundation of their family had been ripped apart, and there was no putting it back together. Not the way it was, not the way it should have been. I wish I could take all this pain away from you, Jason, she said softly. I wish I could fix it. I know you do, Jason replied, his voice barely audible, but I don't know if it can be fixed. Not this, not him. I'm so angry, Mom. I'm so angry at him, and I don't know how to let it go." Maggie leaned back, her eyes filling with tears. "I understand. I don't know how to let it go either." For the first time in a long time, they sat in silence, two broken people, both struggling to make sense of a world that had completely shifted beneath their feet. The walls of their home, once filled with the noise of their family's laughter and the warmth of shared moments, now felt cold, empty. Jason finally spoke again, his voice low but determined. "You know what? I don't want anything from him anymore. I'm done. I'm done with the lies, the excuses. He can't fix this. I don't even want to hear his side of the story. There's nothing he can say that will make me respect him again." Maggie's throat tightened as she nodded. She understood. David had broken something in Jason that couldn't be fixed with words. The damage wasn't just to their relationship. It was to their very perception of who David was, who they both thought he was. "I think it's time for us to move on, Jason," Maggie said quietly. "Not because we can forget, but because we have to live with the truth. And I think we can be stronger without him." Jason didn't reply immediately, but after a long pause, he finally nodded. Maybe you're right, but it's going to take time, Mom. A lot of time." Weeks passed, and the weight of everything still lingered. The house felt different now, quieter. Maggie had tried to keep things normal for Jason, but how could she? The betrayal was like a shadow that hung over every conversation, every movement. David hadn't called. He hadn't tried to reach out. And in a way, Maggie was glad. What would he say now? How could he apologize for destroying everything? Maggie had spent the days since the confrontation thinking about her options. She couldn't stay in this marriage, not after everything that had happened. But leaving David was not as simple as just packing a bag and walking away. There were years of memories, of shared life, of everything they had built together. How did she untangle herself from all of that? Jason had gone through his own struggles. He spent a lot of time alone, walking the streets, trying to make sense of his father's actions. He didn't talk about it much, but Maggie could see the changes in him, the anger, the loss, the way he held himself now, as if he was constantly on guard. He had grown up overnight, losing his innocence to the brutal reality of his father's betrayal. One evening, as Maggie sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, she heard a knock at the door. It was Jason. "I think I'm going to move out, Mom," he said, his voice steady but laced with the weight of finality. "I need to find my own way. I can't live here anymore. Not like this." Maggie looked at him, her heart aching. "Jason, you don't have to leave. Not yet." "I think I do," he said quietly. "I need space. And you do too." Maggie wiped a tear from her eye, not knowing if it was for the loss of her marriage or the loss of her son's innocence. "I understand, honey. I understand more than you know." As Jason left to begin his own path, Maggie knew that the family she once knew was gone. The home she had worked so hard to build was fractured beyond repair. But life moved on, and somehow so would they. For Maggie, the road ahead would be long and filled with hard decisions, but for the first time in a while she felt a flicker of hope. There was a future without David, without the lies, without the betrayal. A future where she could heal, where Jason could heal. It would take time. It would take patience. But in the end, Maggie knew they would find their way, together, apart, or in some new version of a family that had been broken but never fully destroyed.